Okay, so there's a lot of information in this chapter, and what I want to do is try to go through it quickly or in a timely way, but also hit on the key points for the reading. So this is a chapter that sets up the coming 4 week unit and the time period, and we begin really in the progressive era. And I want you to know the context, which shaped public education through the 20th century. I think this is the next major shift where schools really change dramatically, and and then to do that, we'll understand the context, and then to understand the reforms, what we want to do is look at the difference between administrative progressives and pedagogical progressives. So you could look at different strains and different influences of the time period, but I really think this is a really useful way to have a lot of information and look at the two different strains of reforms that were proposed and initiated in the time period. And to do this, what we'll do is we'll specifically look at four individuals, two administrative progressives, Eliot and Coverley, and then on the pedagogical side, we'll look at Dewey and Ella Flagg Young. And then there's a number of core issues or themes that are related to them, like to all four of them, like curriculum differentiation. We'll talk about vocational education, um, democratic reforms, organization and school management, things like that. All right. Whenever I teach this session, I always like to talk, and in class, I talk definitely more in depth about this. But how I feel like we are, at today, really kind of living through a lot of the similar issues related to the progressive era. So, in that time period, there was a tremendous amount of social change. Um, a lot of, I think, reforms in our society. One example that I connect to today is, at that time period, it was the alcohol temperance movement. The legalization of alcohol. Alcohol had been illegal, and the progressive era saw the change of that. And so it was kind of a time where changes that would have been unthinkable, 10 years earlier, were changing. And so today I think we see that with things like, marijuana. 10 years ago, it was hard to find any 10 or 15 years ago any real sitting politicians who were in favor of legalization. Today you see a massive kind of countrywide movement towards legalization. I think in the upcoming election, it's on the ballot in a number of states. Another example would be populism, which again, it's just hard to really sum up in a short period of time. Uh, Generally, this gets translated as sort of a focus on the needs of everyday people, but in reality, I think it's much more complex and much more complicated. Sometimes it's accompanied by things like a rejection of experts and expertise, um, and today we see that definitely. Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders are two populist candidates. I think most all people would agree on that, and you know, less a kind of compelling in terms of their policy so much, but a lot of people just feel like those two individuals really speak to their um, anxieties and issues and concerns. Right. So these are the this is the way that I break up the context for the progressive era, the three major areas: economic reform, political reform, and social reform. And then I try to have you guys look at both the problems or issues and then the way that they sought about solving them. So in the economic area, this would be trusts and monopolies. And hopefully you understand this is when businesses consolidate and basically they squash all competition. There's no competition, and only limited companies. Today, this is an issue with the modern tech companies, and it's complicated. It's kind of a complicated discussion, but 2 days ago, I think it was that the Justice Department announced uh, a case against Google, as that Google, and it's not just that they don't really have competition. It's also that they use their position, they use their power to unfairly with unfair business practices. Amazon recently, like, it was found out that they were, people can sell things on Amazon, so some people really like it for that aspect of it. But they were actually monitoring and collecting data on sellers, and then developing their own brands to market and to use. So just unfair business practices like that. And so there's a lot of concern today about, Apple, Amazon, Facebook. And this was at the time period the businesses were like, Standard Oil, which people used to like, heat their home, and used oil in all these different capacities. And so fluctuations in the cost and the price, gouging, things like that, were very impactful. And so the two different solutions that came about were, Roosevelt wanted to break up the trust, Wilson wanted to regulate them. And what's interesting about the case with Google today is that we're using the same laws from this time period that were passed in this time period to look at Google and determine whether or not it's a monopoly. And Elizabeth Warren, who I think is considered another kind of populist candidate who's run for president recently, she ran on a platform of actually breaking up the tech companies and breaking them into smaller companies. And so that's what people are looking at with Google. The idea would be that some of the services they provide would be broken up into separate companies. Whether or not that happens, we have no idea. Today, we think we have a lot of choices, but really, when you look at it, it's a few companies that own a lot of the different brands and things we use. All right, political reform. At that time period, there was the sense of a lot of corruption. The textbook uses the term political machines, meaning that the parties would become so popular or so powerful that you couldn't influence or have people who would go against the party, or they just wouldn't have that ability. So there was a feeling that people felt alienated from their politics. I think that's the same thing today. Like, what's interesting to me is Donald Trump is considered an outsider politician. And if you look at the recent Republican convention, I don't think George W. Bush or any of the prominent Republicans who had been part of the party in the last, who had really shaped the party over the last 15, 20 years, were even invited to the convention or really a part of it. It shows a major break and change in the party. And so that's part of sort of what happened at this time period as well, a shift in kind of reaction against the existing parties. And some things that were instituted that still have an impact on education today would be things like recall, initiative, and referendum. Recall, where you can, if you feel a politician's corrupt, you can, if you get enough signatures on the ballot, you can literally have an election to try to remove them from office. And about 10 years ago, the governor of Wisconsin attacked the teachers unions, and teachers initiated a recall to recall the governor. It's been tried in a few other states as well. And initiatives and referendums are things that are put on the ballot. And one example of this would be, I mentioned the property tax cap in Indiana. Well, one of the things people do now is put referendums on their ballots to raise money for schools, to try to offset some of the losses from that policy. So it's still used and relevant toward schools today. The other thing that I like to point to is suffrage. That's another major political reform from this time period. Giving 50% of the population essentially the right to vote in women. So massive expansion of voting and voting rights in the country. And women have shaped politics ever since that time period by caring about issues that end up then becoming important to politicians. And I'm not obviously have no way of predicting how the election will turn out, but if you look, and this was true in 2016 too, a major divide between men and women in their voting preferences, or at least enough of a divide that it's significant, and that politicians kind of need to address women's concerns and issues. At least that's kind of the takeaway. All right, the third area would be social reform, and the issue that in this time period was lots of immigrants from Eastern European countries and countries that where assimilation into the U.S. it made it difficult and challenging, and in a number of cases people who were considered a threat culturally. Schools react to this and kind of respond to this by subtractive Americanization. One other example that's given in the reading is Jane Addams, And I think of her sort of as the matriarch of modern social work. That she really influenced that kind of approach to social work in terms of outreach and connecting with people. She had an additive approach to Americanization. She set up the Hull House in Chicago and gave immigrants language courses, citizenship courses, helped them find work. It was set up for resources to help people assimilate and adapt to the U.S. And when we get to John Dewey later, Jane Addams is somebody who interacted and worked with Dewey in Chicago. Okay, so shifting gears now, like to move on. One of the other major things that shaped this time period were laws and new restrictions implemented around child labor. Ending child labor sends a tremendous number of students into the school system and causes need for reform. So this was a movement that happened in the time period, and yeah, there was an organization around this topic, and they hired a photographer to go around the country and take pictures, and some of these pictures really kind of captured the attention and concern of the American people. I've mentioned that this is still an issue worldwide, that working in India over the last 2 years, I had seen a number. In urban areas, you'll tend to see factories that have signs that say no child labor here, but when you get out into the rural areas more, you tend to see it. Young children, 11, 12, 13, working in really difficult situations in factories, and in particular the brick kilns, moving and baking bricks. All right, unions are mentioned in the reading. And look, I always like to point out that unions are very complicated entities that have been very criticized here in the U.S. in recent years, and have been attacked, I think, in a lot of ways. You know, Indiana has become kind of somewhat of a, at least in legislation, anti-union state, although that you can still see union presence throughout Indiana. I would like to point out two things. In the reading, and I think it's page 143 if I remember correctly, I did reference it in the notes that I sent to you, but unions began as protections against self-skilled artisans, to protect, what had previously been skilled artisans, against increasing vulnerability. The way I would explain this is, when you have carpenters and masons and skilled labor, these people often perform a service for somebody or build something, and then they charge for that. So they're in control of that process, and they have a skill that they can take to other places, and earn money for that service. When you have a factory, the person who owns the factory owns the outcome and the product and the things like that. So, what people then do is exchange their labor in it, generally hourly increments or whatever it is, and then they're compensated for that time. But it makes them vulnerable in the sense that if you can find the people to replace them to do the same job for less money, and it leads to, at least historically, forms of exploitation and things like that. So, this is why unions form, to really deal with this transition, and this concern that takes place throughout the United States. The other thing that I want you to remember is that unions are responsible for enacting, employment insurance, or unemployment insurance, which that's a huge thing today. You see around the country with COVID, people being laid off, they have recourse or some form of support in place. If they lose their job, they can receive part of their wages for a period of time. Places are responsible for creating that safety net. So workmen's compensation, people who get hurt have protections, and then things like they oppose child labor and supported other protections and things for workers. So I want you to be familiar with those two aspects of unions from the reading. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit about teacher organizations and teacher unions. All right. So one of the other things that happened in this time period is centralization and consolidation. And this happens in a number of ways, both in terms of management and then physically. So a lot of the system I think we take for granted today um, where you have maybe a number of different elementary schools. Those elementary schools feed into a middle school. They fit into a high school. You have a superintendent who maybe oversees multiple different, many different schools and teachers. So there's a consolidation of students. This happens around the country. No longer do you have each little neighborhood that has its own sort of little like kind of schoolhouse. You end up getting actual schools with classrooms, and then you get a change in the management and the structure of those schools. And we'll get into these, and I'll give examples of that. I think that overall, a lot of this reorganization and structuring was probably positive and something that's been helpful and useful to this day. I also think at the time period what happened was, once you see factories like Henry Ford and mass production through assembly lines, it's obviously on many levels a wonderful thing. You get the mass production of goods, makes it available to a wider range of audience, people, positive outcome. But some people, I think that now everything can be run in the same way that a factory is, or they seem to want to apply sometimes this model to everything. And so you get in schools a kind of what they call a cult of efficiency in the reading, where the idea is that everything in the school can be managed sort of like an assembly line. And I think in my sense this leads to an overly kind of technocratic approach to education, and then things like tracking vocational education, trying to slot kids into different programs in a way that's problematic, that I think we'll come to see. All right. You also get, for progressive education, you get a number of reforms introduced into schools. The 8 to 4 school day, and on Canvas I'll share with you a link to a video. But I always like to point out that a number of these things are being reconsidered today. Even like start times, or the amount of time the kids are in school. Research has shown that high school students kind of get up too early. They don't perform as well in school when they have less sleep. And the idea is that they should sleep more a little bit later, so to restructure things. But this is when we get that full school day. The massive growth of high schools and secondary education come from this time period. If you were involved in extracurricular activities, you really owe the progressive era a debt of gratitude, because this is when language clubs and sports and music and band and theater and all these different kind of activities, this broad spectrum of activities, are introduced into schools. And it's just a very different ethos in the progressive era. I mean, there was really a focus on providing students with services that they needed. So one example, if we look at COVID today, I think one of the issues that's come up is, most schools today don't even have, well, I think a quarter of schools lack a full-time nurse or, proper medical services in school. So a lot of kids today don't have access to a nurse. In the progressive era, most school systems, kids would have had multiple nurses and medical people in the school. So when the 1918 influenza hit, a lot of people thought students were actually better off at their school than they were living in wherever they lived in cities, because they generally lived in close quarters and tenement areas, and they thought with proper ventilation and medical facilities, they could actually protect kids better in school than they could out of. That was kind of the way that the progressive era focused on school and students. Today, I think, again, we're seeing a shift away from a number of those reforms. Whether we go back to them is kind of a big question. All right, so I'm going to go through this chart, and I think I'm going to move on to some other slides as I go through it. But I will give you, on the top row, I ask about, I think whether or not they're progressive or administrative. So the first two, Cobberly and Eliot, are administrative. Second two, Dewey and Ella Flagg Young, are pedagogical. That would help to know, be helpful to know. And then with their background or affiliation, I think it more helps the one that really stands out is Eliot. I would associate with being at Harvard. He was the longest sitting president of Harvard, and the member of the Committee of 10. That committee really influenced education in the country, promoted the growth of high schools, a number of different things. Eliot was a part of that. Cubberley was at Stanford. He had a lot of influence on textbooks and curriculum for this time period. John Dewey was all over the place. We're going to talk about John Dewey next week in more depth, so you don't have to worry quite as much about him. You might associate him with Chicago and University of Chicago and then Teachers College, Columbia. And then Ella Flagg Young was also in Chicago, friends with John Dewey. So with kind of moving forward with Cubberley really quickly, I would look at his quotes. Very much this idea of, he calls schools factories, materials are to be furnished. Very much, he had very derogatory views of Eastern Europeans. He called them, lazy, docile, lacking in initiative. He was the people I would connect him to are from when we talked about IQ testing with Terman and Goddard. Very similar beliefs in, IQ was fixed, it was limited. In terms of how it could be developed, and so promoted tracking and vocational education. Again, why should we pay and invest in a student if they're going to end up working in a factory? Cubberley was more nuanced and complicated. Again, longest sitting president. Oh, that's Cubberley. Eliot was Harvard, much more nuanced. He introduced the elective system into Harvard and then also promoted it in high schools. So if you liked picking some of your classes and kind of taking a different course structure, that was something Eliot introduced and that became popular in this time period. I really like his view that education is to discipline the mind. He looked at it not just like it's, in some cases learning things like languages, I think in his perception, were just good. Not that you might always use that language or need to have it, but it was a useful exercise in helping your mind kind of develop and grow. So he promoted a well-rounded system, even though he saw different tracks and having tracks. He really wanted kids to have access to languages, complicated math instruction, things like that. But ultimately, his suggestions were rejected, and the way that things went were sort of hijacked in many ways. And what was really promoted in that time period was vocational education, preparing kids to work in factories, often kids who came from working class backgrounds. Whenever I drive up from Indiana up through to Chicago, and you go through Gary, and there's kind of an area where you're coming into Chicago, there's this massive vocational high school that's still, it's empty to this day. It looks to me like it seems like it's been shut down for a very long time, but it just screams to me of like the progressive era. It just the size and scope of it and how big it is and how many kids would have went to it, it just really looks like and those kids would have ended up working in the factories kind of in that area. Today, there's a movement to rethink and reconsider vocational education. That's something Joe Biden is promoting in his education plan. But I think it's an approach to vocational education that's much more academically rigorous. So, pedagogical progressives. One of the other things to mention is that a key theme through all four of these individuals is curriculum differentiation. To differentiate the curriculum, what that means is in the common school era, it was really a novel idea. The idea is all kids are going to learn a similar curriculum, whether you're rich or you're poor. You have access to similar materials and curriculum. Here, the idea is we should differentiate, give different kids different things to learn. For administrative progressives, that meant preparing them, for many on the administrative side, that meant preparing them to work in factories or not giving them a rigorous curriculum. A smaller group of students would be prepared for college and things like that, but differentiating in that way. For John Dewey and Ella Flagg Young, curriculum differentiation meant more what we would today we use the term, and it's kind of don't like it because it's overly simplistic in my mind, but we use the term student-centered learning. That kind of approach. All right, so on the pedagogical side, John Dewey, he, I think Johns Hopkins, where he did his PhD, I think had a lot of influence on him. He was in favor of a curriculum connected to real life. He did promote what we would, again, today call student-centered or child-centered learning. And again, we're going to go more in depth with Dewey, but I think the core things I would remember are there's a strong connection between education and growth, which I will explain in depth next week when we talk about him. And then 2, a strong connection between education and democracy. Probably one of his most famous books is Democracy and Education. It's a whole book that teases out the connection between education and democracy, and I think he looked at democracy much more, or as a kind of organic, evolving, changing system that was often under threat from different forces, and that students need to be prepared to function and live in a democratic system. That definitely seems to carry some weight today in my mind. In terms of impact on schools, I always like to point out that I think the administrative progressives had a really strong influence on schools. The pedagogical progressives did not. They just didn't really have an impact on the actual functioning of schools in that time period. One of the things, though, that Dewey did do that would be helpful to know is he started the lab school system. And lab schools exist now around the country. There's one at Ball State. Burris is a lab school. They probably changed a lot, I think, from the way Dewey envisioned them. But in some ways, they still, I think, try to remain connected to that vision he had. And some are much more connected. There are actually some lab schools that are very, very Deweyan in their approach. But that would be one impact. Ella Flagg Young, the way she's described in the reading, it's like on paper you would think she's a administrative progressive. She was a teacher, she was a principal, superintendent. The thing that makes her a pedagogical progressive is that she believes strongly in sharing authority with the teachers. That would be important to know. And so sharing authority with teachers, she thought administrators and teachers should both work together and have influence over schools. And then also, she believed in child-centered learning, which would be another major influence. She was also a part of the Chicago Teachers Union in that time period. All right, I'm going to try to wrap up. I think I've covered a lot of core things. I would recommend going through the reading, obviously, taking notes, using the reading notes. Another area that's important to kind of touch on with centralization and consolidation, there was kind of like what happened and then the impact. In terms of democracy, there's a quote in the reading, during this time period, public schools became less and less schools of the public. That would be an important quote to remember. That's detailed in a little more in depth in the reading. Essentially, this is where we get for the formation of things like school boards. And school boards, even today, this is still an issue. Some operate really great, and it's a very good connection. Other times, there's an adversarial relationship and major problems between school systems, administrators, teachers, and the school board. And that's because oftentimes school boards are made up by people who are more wealthy or highly educated, and sometimes, throughout the 20th century, working class people have felt detached or disconnected from school boards. One of the things pre-COVID that I did with students was I would offer options for an assignment and where they could go out into different areas and learn more about things like teacher unions, and one of the things I allowed for students to do was sit in on school board meetings, which to be honest with you, from my perspective, sometimes can be intensely boring, but also can be really intense and emotional. It's sometimes a place where teachers air their grievances. I've seen teachers come into school board meetings and resign and give very powerful speeches. People from the community will sometimes come in and raise issues. It's sort of an interface between school systems and the public. And that's one of the issues. In terms of management, what happened is that the birth of things like school boards and superintendents often distanced administrators from the actual work of teaching. And there were gaps sometimes with gender. Women started remaining in teaching as a profession. The profession grew and developed in this time period, but oftentimes a disconnect happened between management and teachers. And this was one of the reasons that teacher organizations or teacher unions began to develop. The other thing that I want to hit on with teacher organizations and teacher unions is that they developed as support groups for teachers. That's another important point to note from the reading. I think he calls them mutual aid groups. They began as mutual aid groups. Women are remaining in teaching as a profession, very vulnerable in this time period if they got pregnant or got sick, or something happened that prevented them from being at work the full time. So what teachers did was they formed groups among each other in areas like Chicago and started networks to support one another. Eventually that grew into more formal organizations. They modeled themselves after labor union. And teacher organizations are very complex. In class, I try to go into them much more in depth. Today we have two national organizations, the National Education Association, the American Federation of Teachers. They are national umbrellas. And then at the state level, in Indiana, I'll use Indiana as an example, you have the Indiana Teachers Association, which is under the National Education Association. I think in Indiana, there's still like 1,000 teachers that belong to the American Federation of Teachers, but most are, if they are in a union, they're in the National Education Association. And then there's district level organizations. So, all right, so if you're in Muncie, you're working as a teacher, and you decide to join a union, you would join the Muncie Teachers Association, which would be connected to the Indiana State Teachers Association, and you would also be a member of the National Education Association. So all three of those education sort of entities you would be a part of by being a member of the union. Reasons people join a union would be things like insurance, support to help negotiate for wages and benefits. And when I was in California, even like things like when the school day started, when it ended. My principal couldn't say you need to be here at 6 a.m. because the union negotiated and set the time when you came, when you left. Of course, now, obviously, if you're asked to stay, then you know what I mean? It's more complicated that in practice a lot of times, but there are limits, that are implemented through unions. That's why I think some people really feel strongly positively about them. That's why some are very negative. Some people feel like unions have protected bad teachers, that they've made it virtually impossible for principals to get rid of teachers who are not performing well. That's a complicated issue, I think. My feeling would be that teachers deserve, after a period of time, once they've proven themselves, then for someone to fire them, there should be due process. And so that's kind of a complicated issue that's come up in recent years. Many other union issues we could spend, days and hours talking about. And I'll just tell you one of my quick thoughts. One, they get blamed a lot for creating all the problems in education. I think that's just crazy. There's no real correlation that you would see between states with strong unions and student performance. And, it's not that states without unions do poorly. It's not that states with unions do poorly. It's much more complicated than that. I don't think you know, unions are really correlated strongly with student performance or educational outcomes. Um, they're just, again, complicated sort of entities. My question would be, in today's world, I sometimes feel like the unions, the two major unions, and especially to maybe for me today more the American Federation of Teachers, tends to wade into political domains, um, which I mean I think they tend to support candidates they think are better for teachers. That I partly understand, but they just wade into political debates where I feel like they don't really need to. Um, and I feel like this has in some cases had a negative impact, and I just think been pretty problematic. And my question would be whether, they evolved in the model of labor unions, and I tend to think now perhaps should evolve more in the direction of professional organizations. Um, so this would mean like the American Medical Association is an example of a professional organization that sets the requirements to be a doctor, that lobbies on behalf of doctors, that is there to, you know, help with things like liability insurance for doctors, all these other issues. I think that the AMA would be involved in, but just different than a labor union in terms of striking and being so inherently outwardly political and things like that. And to give you a cross comparison, with today discussions over criminal justice reform and different issues, the police unions now too are being criticized and looked at, and I think they have different histories, but I also think have similarities in the sense that today they represent professions and professionals. They still tend to do it much in a kind of labor union sort of format, um, and the question is whether they need to sort of evolve and change. So, sorry, I kind of rambled on a little bit too much there with that, but I do hope you'll take time to understand unions, and I like the term teacher organizations, but I would just recommend to try to learn more about them and to ask teachers that you respect and that you work with what their feelings are. Ask your principals and administrators, and sort of get a sense for yourself about them, and yeah, and just try to kind of learn a little more about them. So I hope this is helpful, and just email me if you have any questions.